4:53 in the morning. The parking lot of the Loblaws on Carling Avenue is almost empty. One car idling near the entrance, a cart pusher in an orange vest moving slow across the asphalt, and a woman, early 30s, long coat, no umbrella, crouching down beside a man sitting on the curb near the automatic doors. She wasn't supposed to be there. She'd just come off a 12-hour shift at the private security firm where she worked contract. She had groceries to buy, a bus to catch, and approximately zero interest in anyone else's problems that morning. But she stopped anyway. That's the thing about Tessa Drummond. She always stops. The man on the curb was maybe 65, gray stubble, a thin jacket for October. He had a plastic bag beside him, the kind you get at a dollar store, and it was half open, and inside it were things that didn't make sense together. A phone charger, one shoe, a birthday card still in its envelope. He was looking at his hands the way people look at things that used to belong to them. Tessa had seen that look before. Not here, not in Ottawa. In places she doesn't talk about at dinner parties. She asked him if he was okay. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'm waiting for my daughter. Is she coming soon?" She said she'd be here by 4. It was 5 to 5. Tessa sat down on the curb beside him. Not squatted, not hovered. Sat down on the cold asphalt, in her work coat. His name was Harold Keene. He'd been a machinist for 31 years at a plant in Canada that had since closed. His wife had passed 4 winters ago. He had a daughter named. And she told him not to use her name when he talked to strangers, which he thought was very strange advice. But he called her his girl. He said she was going to pick him up and take him somewhere warm. Tessa asked if he'd eaten. He said he'd had a muffin yesterday at the church on Baseline. She went inside the Loblaws. She came back with a coffee, a sandwich still warm, and a small container of soup. She set them beside him and said nothing. He looked at the food the way people look at something they thought they'd lost the right to expect. He ate slowly. She sat with him. They didn't talk much. At some point he asked her name, and she told him, and he said, "That's a strong name." She said, "My mother thought so." At 6:15, a car pulled up. Black Audi. Clean. The woman who stepped out was in her mid-40s, sharp coat, sharp boots. She looked at her father on the curb, then at Tessa, and something in her expression shifted. Not to relief, not quite to gratitude, but to something complicated. Her name, Tessa would learn later, was Natalie Ashford Keene. She was a real estate developer. She'd built several mid-rise condos in Westboro, and she was in the middle of closing a deal worth somewhere north of $40 million, and she had a reputation in this city for being extremely good at getting what she wanted. She said, "Who are you?" Tessa said, "Nobody. I was just keeping him company." Natalie looked at the coffee cup, the sandwich wrapper, the soup container. Then she looked at her father. "Dad, did this woman give you money?" "She got me breakfast." "From inside the store?" "Yes." Something crossed Natalie's face that Tessa couldn't fully read. She said, "I'll reimburse you." Tessa said, "That's not necessary. I insist." "I said it's not necessary." There was a pause. Natalie looked at her like she'd said something rude. Then she got Harold into the car, put his plastic bag in the trunk with what looked like mild distaste, and drove away. Tessa caught her bus. She bought her groceries at a different store. She went home and slept for 7 hours. She didn't think about it again. 3 weeks later, she got a call from a lawyer. Not her lawyer. She didn't have a lawyer. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while she was doing a site walkthrough for a client in Centertown, and the man on the phone introduced himself as working for a firm called Ashford Keene Capital Holdings, which, he explained, was the corporate entity associated with the Ashford Keene family. He said, "Miss Drummond, we have some questions about your interaction with Mr. Harold Keene on the morning of October the 9th. Tessa stopped walking. "Okay. Specifically, we'd like to understand the nature of your involvement. I sat with him for an hour and bought him a sandwich. And you didn't know him prior to that encounter?" "No, you had no prior relationship with the family." "No, and you didn't record the interaction, or take photographs, or contact any media organization afterward. She said, "What is this about?" He said he wasn't at liberty to say more at this time, but that she might be contacted again and that she should retain any receipts or communications related to the event. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot of a building she was supposed to be securing and thought about what had just happened. Then she called her friend Margot, who had done 2 years of law school before switching to social work, and told her the whole story. Margot said, "They're building a file on you." "For what?" "I don't know yet. But people like Natalie Ashford Keene don't have lawyers make casual phone calls." That was a warning dressed up as a question. Here's what Tessa didn't know yet. Harold Keene, 67 years old, former machinist, man with one shoe in a plastic bag and a birthday card he hadn't sent, had gone home that morning and written a letter to his estate lawyer. In the letter, he described the woman who sat with him on the curb. He described what she'd done, and then he revised his will. Not dramatically, not in the way movies do it, where someone suddenly inherits a mansion. What Harold did was quieter than that. He took a portion of the money he'd saved over 31 years, money his daughter had assumed would fold cleanly into the family estate, and he directed it to a fund he'd quietly set up with his estate lawyer years ago. A small emergency housing trust he'd started in his wife's name after she passed. He'd never told Natalie about it. He'd been meaning to. He just kept not finding the right time. And then he added a note. The note said something like, "There are people who stop, and there are people who don't. The ones who stop, I want them to be okay." He died 11 days after that morning in the parking lot. Heart failure, in his sleep. In his apartment on Richmond Road, with the birthday card on the nightstand, still sealed, because it had been meant for his wife, and he'd been carrying it for 4 years. Tessa found out he had died the same way most people find out things now. A Google alert she'd set up after the lawyer's call. She was trying to understand what she'd walked into. She found a small obituary in the Citizen. Harold William Keene, survived by his daughter, Natalie. She read it twice. She sat for a while. Then she went to her shift. The second call came from a different lawyer, a different firm. This one introduced herself as Celeste. She gave a surname Tessa would later have to look up twice to spell correctly, and she said she was representing the estate of Harold Keene and that Tessa had been named in the estate documentation. Not as a beneficiary exactly, as what Celeste called a named witness to character which had attached to it a discretionary gift of $12,000 from Harold's housing trust. Tessa said, "I don't understand." Celeste said, "Mr. Keene wanted it to go to someone who had shown him uncalculated kindness. Those are the words he used. Uncalculated." Tessa asked if she had to do anything to receive it. Celeste said the process was straightforward, but that there was a complication. Of course there was. Natalie Ashford Keene had contested the revision. Not the trust itself, not the amount. What she contested was the characterization of the event. That this woman her father had met outside a Loblaws at 5 in the morning had influenced his estate decisions. She had filed a motion arguing undue influence. She had submitted a declaration describing Tessa as a stranger who had inserted herself into a vulnerable moment to gain favor with an elderly man. She had also, and this is the part that made Tessa's stomach clench, filed a complaint with the firm that had issued Tessa's security license, suggesting that Tessa had been operating outside her license parameters that morning, potentially as part of a pattern of behavior targeting vulnerable individuals. This is what money does. Not always, but sometimes. It turns something clean into something with fingerprints all over it. Tessa was not the kind of woman who cried easily. She'd done 2 tours, one embedded with a logistics unit in a place she still describes only as overseas, one with a private contracting firm doing close protection work in West Africa. She'd been through a dislocated shoulder, a broken tooth, a relationship that ended badly enough to rearrange her understanding of trust. She was not delicate, but she sat in her apartment on a Wednesday night with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she read the legal filing that Celeste had forwarded, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Small. Not guilty, not ashamed, just small. Like the things she thought were visible were actually invisible. Like a man dying was just a transaction to be contested, and the woman who sat with him in the cold was a liability to be managed. She called Margot again. Margot said, "We fight it." Tessa said, "I'm not sure I want $12,000 that badly." Margot said, "This isn't about the money." It almost wasn't about the money, except that it was also a little bit about the money, because Tessa had been carrying a balance on her line of credit since she left her last long-term contract, and her security license renewal was due in January. And $12,000 was real. It was a real number in her real life. But more than that, and this is the part she told Margot but wouldn't tell most people, it was about Harold's note. The one his estate lawyer read to her over the phone. There are people who stop, and there are people who don't. She didn't want that to get buried under paperwork. The hearing was set for February. In the meantime, Natalie's lawyer sent a second filing. This one including a statement from the parking lot attendant at the Loblaws, who said he'd seen Tessa approach Harold, not the other way around, which was true. She had approached him. She didn't dispute that, but the filing made it sound calculated, predatory, almost. They also found Tessa's LinkedIn profile and included a screenshot of it in the filing. Her description: close protection specialist, corporate security, 12 years experience. The filing suggested this indicated a professional background that made her experienced in identifying and approaching individuals in states of distress. Tessa stared at that sentence for a long time. She had met men like Natalie before. Not women. Men, mostly. In boardrooms and base camps and SUVs with blacked-out windows. Men who could look at something human and see only its tactical dimensions. She'd thought for a long time that this was a failure of imagination. Now she wasn't so sure it wasn't a choice. Here's where things shifted, and I want you to understand something before I tell you this next part. Tessa did not plan what happened. She was not strategic. She was not, as Natalie's lawyers tried to argue, running some kind of long game. What happened was smaller than that and more human. She went to the church on Baseline Road, the one Harold had mentioned, the one where he'd gotten a muffin. She didn't know why. Exactly. She told herself she was just going. She went on a Saturday morning when they put out the breakfast table for the neighborhood. She sat. She drank bad coffee. She talked to a woman named, and I'm going to just call her the woman at the table, because she asked for her name to stay out of things, who had run the Saturday breakfast for 11 years. This woman knew Harold. She had known Harold for 3 years. He came almost every Saturday. He helped fold napkins. He wasn't confused or lost or incapable. He was lonely, and he was gentle, and he had opinions about hockey and strong feelings about the quality of margarine versus butter. And he'd told this woman, about a month before he died, that he'd met someone in a parking lot who'd sat with him and bought him soup. He talked about it more than once, the woman said. He did? He said. She paused, looking for the right words. He said it was the first time in a long time that someone had just sat, not fixed, not taken over, just sat. Tessa didn't say anything for a moment. The woman said, he was a good man. His daughter. She stopped, started again. People grieve in different ways. Tessa asked if she would be willing to write a letter, not for the hearing, just a letter, saying what Harold was like, who he was. A character letter for the estate file. The woman said yes. 2 more letters came in before the hearing. One from his estate lawyer, who had known Harold for 9 years, and who stated plainly that Harold had been of exceptionally sound mind at the time of the revision, that he had asked thoughtful questions, that he had used the phrase uncalculated kindness deliberately and after consideration, and that he had mentioned the woman from the parking lot by name. The other letter was from a man named, and this part still gets Tessa, a man named Oliver who was Harold's neighbor at the Richmond Road building, who said Harold had knocked on his door the morning he came home from that parking lot at 7:30 in the morning to tell him about the woman who'd bought him a sandwich. He said he wanted someone to know, Oliver wrote, in case it mattered later. He said he'd had a feeling it might matter. The hearing was not dramatic in the way courtroom scenes are dramatic on television. There was no big reveal. No one broke down and confessed. It was a small room with a mediator and 2 sets of lawyers, and Tessa sitting on one side in the coat she'd worn to every serious meeting of her adult life. Natalie was there. This was the first time Tessa had seen her face to face since that morning in the parking lot. She was composed. Expensive haircut. Laptop open. She looked at Tessa once briefly, the way you look at something you're trying to assess. Tessa looked back. The mediator reviewed the documentation, the estate lawyer's letter, the character letters, the timeline of Harold's estate revision. He asked Tessa to describe, in her own words, what had happened on the morning of October the 9th. She described it, exactly as it happened. The curb, the plastic bag with one shoe, the birthday card still sealed, the coffee and the sandwich and the soup, the hour of sitting in the cold. She said, "He told me he was waiting for his daughter. I didn't ask anything else." The mediator asked Natalie's lawyer if there was any evidence that Tessa had been aware of Harold's estate prior to his death, or had made any inquiry into his financial situation. There was not. He asked if there was any evidence of prior contact between Tessa and Harold. There was not. He asked about the complaint filed with the licensing board. Natalie's lawyer said that the complaint had been submitted out of concern for the integrity of the process. The mediator said he'd noted that. He said it quietly, in the tone of someone noting something they fully intend to follow up on. The motion was denied. Natalie did not speak to Tessa directly. She gathered her things, said something quiet to her lawyer, and left, her heels on the floor, the door closing behind her. Tessa sat for a moment in the empty room. Celeste was beside her, reviewing something on her tablet. Outside, through a window that faced Elgin Street, there were people walking in the February cold, scarves up, heads down, the city doing what it does. She thought about Harold's note. The ones who stop, I want them to be okay. The licensing complaint was dropped 3 weeks later. No findings, no record. The $12,000 was released to Tessa the following month. She put $4,000 toward her line of credit. She put $3,000 into an emergency fund she hadn't had before. And she put $5,000 into Harold's housing trust, the one he'd set up in his wife's name, the one Natalie had never known about, the one that now had a small board of 3 people, one of whom was the woman from the Saturday breakfast at the church on Baseline Road. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. She didn't announce it. She didn't post about it. She told Margot over the phone, and Margot said, "That's very you," which was the best compliment she'd received in recent memory. Natalie Ashford Keene issued a short public statement about 6 weeks after the hearing, after a local journalist, someone who'd come across the estate filing through a contact at the courthouse, began making inquiries. The statement said she had been concerned about the circumstances surrounding her father's final weeks and had sought legal clarity, and that she respected the outcome of the process. She did not mention Tessa by name. Tessa's name appeared in the article anyway. The journalist described her as a security professional and veteran who spent an hour with a stranger on a parking lot curb in October. The article ran in the Citizen on a Thursday. It got a moderate amount of online engagement, mostly comments from people saying things like, "This is the Canada I want to live in," and "Why does doing the right thing require lawyers?" Fair questions, honestly. Tessa doesn't talk about this often. She told me the story over coffee at a place on Bank Street, and she told it the way people tell stories they've told before, but still don't quite know what to do with. Like the meaning is still being worked out. Like the ending isn't as clean as it looks written down. She said, I think about the birthday card a lot. I asked what she meant. She said, he carried it for 4 years. It was for his wife. And he never sent it because you can't send a card to someone who's gone. But he didn't throw it away either. And that seems like a very human thing to do. To keep carrying something that has no destination anymore. She looked out the window at Bank Street for a moment. I hope someone read it to him at the end. Or read it out loud in that apartment before they cleared everything out. I hope someone did that. I don't know if anyone did. But I think Harold knew by then that someone would have.